My identification is inside my coat, officer. I am reaching for it now. Colonel Danielle Harper said the words slowly, clearly, and with both hands visible beneath the cold fluorescent glow outside a convenience store in Northern Virginia. Officer Eric Dalton stood several feet away, tense and watchful, while his younger partner, Officer Noah Bennett, remained near the patrol vehicle. Danielle had already explained where the identification was located. Dalton had already told her to retrieve it. She moved exactly as instructed. Then everything changed in less than a second. A single gunshot broke the quiet of the parking lot. Danielle stopped moving. Noah's face went pale as he looked toward her open hand. There was no weapon, only a wallet slipping toward the pavement. "Do not move," Dalton said. But the command sounded different now, thinner somehow, as if even he could hear what had just happened. Danielle remained conscious, her breathing controlled despite the shock. She lowered herself carefully and looked toward Noah. "My identification," she said. "Check it." Noah moved toward the wallet while calling for medical assistance. Dalton stood frozen, eyes fixed on Danielle's coat pocket as though waiting for the threat he believed he had seen to finally appear. Nothing did. Noah opened the wallet. Driver's license. Military identification. United States Army credentials. He looked at the photograph, then at Danielle. "Colonel Danielle Harper," he read quietly. Dalton turned toward him. "What?" 15 minutes earlier, Danielle had left an Army leadership meeting wearing civilian business clothes, a charcoal coat over a navy blouse, tailored slacks, and practical shoes. She had been headed toward Fort Belvoir for a scheduled check-in when she stopped for bottled water and coffee. Her government access parking permit was visible through the windshield of her dark sport utility vehicle. Someone nearby had called police about what dispatch described only as a suspicious government-style vehicle lingering near the store. Dalton arrived first. Danielle had been standing beside the driver's door when he approached. "Is this your vehicle?" he asked. "Yes." "Why do you have government parking credentials?" "Because I am authorized to use them." Dalton's expression hardened. "Authorized by who?" Danielle looked at him. "The United States Army." Noah arrived moments later and heard the rest. Dalton asked for registration. Danielle provided it. The vehicle was registered to her. Insurance was current. Nothing in the database suggested theft, fraud, or a wanted person. Yet Dalton kept questioning her. "What do you do for the Army?" "I am on active duty." "Doing what?" Danielle paused. "That is not necessary to verify the vehicle." Dalton stared at her. "You seem pretty defensive." "I answered your question." Noah glanced at the mobile computer. "Eric, everything on the vehicle checks out." Dalton ignored him. "Identification." Danielle nodded toward her coat. "My identification is inside the left pocket. Do you want me to get it?" Dalton said yes. Noah heard him. The body camera heard him. Danielle repeated the location before moving. Then came the shot. Now, with emergency lights beginning to reflect across the storefront glass, Noah held the military identification in his hand and looked at Dalton with disbelief. "She told you exactly what she was reaching for." Dalton's face had lost its certainty. Danielle looked toward the small red light still glowing on his body camera. Her voice was weaker, but steady. "Keep that camera running." Noah nodded immediately. Danielle's secure phone began vibrating inside her briefcase near the front seat of the vehicle. Once, then again. She knew why. She was already late for her military check-in. Somewhere at Fort Belvoir, someone was beginning to ask where Colonel Danielle Harper had gone. And outside that convenience store, two officers were only beginning to understand that the most important evidence was not her rank. It was the command Dalton had given seconds before everything went wrong. Noah Bennett kept one hand raised toward the arriving paramedics and the other near Danielle Harper's wallet, making sure nothing around it was disturbed. Eric Dalton stood several feet away, no longer speaking with the certainty he had shown minutes earlier. The emergency medical team moved quickly but calmly, asking Danielle simple questions while checking her condition. She answered every one. Name, age, whether she could hear them clearly, whether she knew where she was. Her voice remained steady enough that Noah found it more unsettling than panic would have been. "Colonel Harper," one paramedic said, "we are taking you to the hospital for evaluation." Danielle nodded. Then she looked directly at Noah. "My briefcase stays with the vehicle until the proper military contact arrives." Noah understood immediately. "Yes, ma'am." Dalton finally spoke. "We need to secure everything as evidence." Danielle turned her eyes toward him. Then secure it. Do not open it. Dalton hesitated. Noah answered first. We will preserve it. The distinction mattered. Danielle's briefcase contained official materials, but she had no intention of turning sensitive documents into proof that she deserved to be believed. Her identification had already been enough. It had simply been ignored until after the moment that mattered most. As the paramedics prepared to move her, her secure phone vibrated again inside the vehicle. Noah glanced toward it. Someone keeps calling. Danielle closed her eyes briefly. Major Rachel Cooper. Your aide? Yes. She opened her eyes again. She will be looking for me. Noah looked toward Dalton. We should notify command. Dalton's expression tightened. We need to notify our supervisor first. Noah stared at him. We can do both. For once, Dalton did not argue. Captain Melissa Grant arrived before the ambulance left. She stepped from an unmarked department vehicle, listened to Noah's first account, then looked toward Dalton. Did dispatch report a weapon? No, Captain. Did the vehicle come back stolen? No. Did she tell you where the identification was? Dalton hesitated. Noah answered quietly. Yes. She said it was in the left inside pocket. Eric told her to retrieve it. Grant's eyes moved toward the red indicator on Dalton's body camera. Is that recording still active? Yes. Good. Nobody touches that file. She turned to Noah. You're recording too. He nodded. Danielle heard every word from the stretcher. Captain. Grant approached. Yes, ma'am. Danielle looked at her. Preserve the dispatch audio, the store surveillance, both cameras, and the first radio transmission. Grant studied her for a moment. We will, Danielle continued. And note that the original call concerned a suspicious vehicle, not an armed person. Grant's expression shifted. Understood. The ambulance doors closed a few minutes later, leaving the parking lot suddenly quieter despite the flashing lights. Grant turned toward Dalton. Walk me through the sequence. He started with the suspicious vehicle call, the government parking permit, Danielle's answers, and the request for identification. Grant stopped him. When did you believe she had a weapon? Dalton looked toward the pavement where the wallet had fallen. When her hand moved inside the coat. Noah shook his head. After you told her to reach for the identification. Dalton looked at him. It happened fast. She said what she was doing first. Noah. She did. Grant raised one hand. Enough. We are not resolving this here. She ordered Dalton relieved from active field duty, pending the initial review, and directed another officer to secure the scene. Noah watched Dalton surrender his patrol vehicle keys without protest. Across town, Major Rachel Cooper had already escalated Danielle's missed check-in through the Army command chain. When a hospital registration clerk entered Danielle's name into the system, a call was placed to the designated military contact listed with her emergency information. Rachel answered on the first ring. This is Major Cooper. The clerk identified the hospital. Rachel's face went still. Is Colonel Harper conscious? Yes, ma'am. Rachel closed her eyes for 1 second, then reached for another secure line. Within minutes, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hayes was notified. Back at the convenience store, Captain Grant's telephone rang. She answered expecting dispatch. Instead, a formal voice identified itself through the military liaison channel. Captain Grant, this is Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hayes. I am calling regarding Colonel Danielle Harper. Grant looked toward Dalton, then toward the body camera evidence being logged. Yes, Colonel, she said carefully. We are preserving everything. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hayes arrived at the hospital less than an hour later, carrying no entourage and making no demands. He found Major Rachel Cooper outside the treatment area, still holding Danielle Harper's secure phone and the sealed briefcase that had been transferred under documented custody. How is she? He asked. Rachel kept her voice low. Conscious. Stable. Doctors are keeping her for observation. Hayes nodded once, then looked through the glass toward the hallway. Danielle had spent years teaching junior officers that discipline mattered most when fear tried to replace thought. Now she was living inside that lesson. When Captain Melissa Grant arrived, Hayes introduced himself and immediately clarified his purpose. I am here to confirm Colonel Harper's identity, coordinate return of protected government materials, and make sure your department has the correct military contact information. I am not here to interfere with your investigation. Grant appreciated that more than she said. We have already preserved both body cameras, dispatch audio, store surveillance, and the first reports from the scene. Good. Rachel looked at her. Was there any weapon recovered? Grant shook her head. No. The answer settled over the hallway. Hayes did not react dramatically. He simply asked, did dispatch report an armed person? No. Did Colonel Harper announce what she was reaching for? Grant paused. According to the preliminary statements, yes. Rachel closed her eyes briefly. Hayes looked toward the treatment room. Then the recording matters more than anything we say here. Grant nodded. Back at the precinct, Officer Noah Bennett sat alone in an interview room while an internal affairs investigator named Daniel Price reviewed his initial statement. Start before the shot, Price said. Noah leaned forward, hands clasped. She was calm. Eric asked for identification. She said it was in the inside left pocket of her coat. He told her to get it. How certain are you? Completely. Did she move before being told? No. Did she make any threatening statement? No. Did dispatch mention a weapon? No. Price wrote without comment. What did you see after the shot? Noah swallowed. A wallet. Her military identification was inside. Price stopped writing. Anything else? Noah looked down. Her hands were empty. Across the building, Eric Dalton gave his own statement. He said the movement toward the coat had appeared sudden. He said training taught officers that hands could become dangerous faster than words could explain them. He said the entire moment had happened in a fraction of a second. Price listened. Then he asked one question. Did you tell her to retrieve the identification? Dalton hesitated. I believe so. Did she tell you where it was? Another pause. I would need to review the footage. Price nodded. That is exactly what we are going to do. By early evening, Captain Grant joined Price in a secure review room. They watched Dalton's body camera from the moment he approached Danielle's vehicle. The suspicious vehicle call was vague. Registration came back valid. Insurance was current. Noah's voice could be heard saying everything checked out. Then came Dalton asking for identification. Danielle's voice was clear. My identification is inside the left pocket. Do you want me to get it? Dalton answered, yes. Slowly, Grant froze the video. Nobody in the room spoke. Price resumed playback. Danielle announced the movement again before reaching. The camera shifted. The shot followed almost immediately. Price stopped the recording. Grant stared at the screen. Play the 10 seconds before it again. He did. Then again. The sequence did not change. At the hospital, Danielle learned that internal affairs had started reviewing the footage. Rachel expected anger. Instead, Danielle asked, did they preserve the original dispatch? Hayes nodded. Yes. The store video? Yes. Noah's recording? Yes. Danielle rested her head back against the pillow. Then let them work. Rachel looked at her. You could ask for federal involvement. Danielle met her eyes. Not because I am a colonel. Hayes understood immediately. Rank had made the command chain respond quickly, but Danielle did not want rank to become the standard for whose evidence mattered. Later that night, Grant called Hayes with an update. The recording confirms she told Officer Dalton where the identification was and that he instructed her to retrieve it. Hayes was silent for a moment. And the original call? Suspicious vehicle only. No weapon warning. Danielle heard the words through the speaker from several feet away. She closed her eyes, not in relief, but in recognition. The secret the camera held was no longer secret. The question now was what the department would do with a truth that could no longer be explained away. By the following morning, the question surrounding Eric Dalton had changed. It was no longer whether he had misunderstood Danielle Harper's movement. The body camera had already answered that. The harder question was why his judgment had moved faster than the information he had been given. Captain Melissa Grant arrived at the precinct before sunrise and found Internal Affairs Investigator Daniel Price reviewing the incident frame by frame. Noah Bennett's camera showed the same sequence from a different angle. Danielle stood beside her vehicle. Dalton asked for identification. She named the exact pocket. Dalton gave permission to retrieve it. Noah remained several feet away, watching. Nothing in the recording suggested a weapon had been seen before the shot. Grant folded her arms. What does his written statement say? Price opened the preliminary report. He says he perceived a sudden movement toward the coat and believed she might be reaching for a weapon. Does he mention that he told her to reach for the identification? Price shook his head. Not in the first draft. Grant's expression tightened. Does he mention that she announced the location? No. Price turned the laptop toward her. That omission matters. Grant nodded. Then preserve the draft exactly as submitted. Across town, Danielle remained at the hospital under observation. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hayes had returned to his office, but Major Rachel Cooper stayed nearby, with Danielle's permission. Rachel placed a cup of coffee on the table and watched Danielle read a short command update. "You are working?" she asked. Danielle looked up. "I am reading. That is working for you." A faint smile passed across Danielle's face, then disappeared. Rachel sat down. "The Army leadership wants to know whether you want a formal military legal representative present when the department interviews you." Danielle considered it. "Yes, for the interview. Not to control the investigation." "Understood." Rachel hesitated. "They are angry." Danielle closed the folder. "Anger does not improve evidence." "You are not angry." Danielle looked toward the window. "I am very angry." Rachel waited. Danielle continued quietly. "That is why I do not want anger writing the conclusion." Back at the precinct, Price interviewed Noah again, this time focusing on the seconds before Dalton's decision. Did Officer Dalton appear afraid before Colonel Harper reached toward the coat? Noah thought carefully. He was suspicious from the beginning. Suspicious of what? The government parking permit. Her Army connection. The fact that she did not answer every question the way he wanted. Price leaned forward. Did he say anything about her race? No. Did he make any racial remark? No. Noah shook his head, but he kept treating normal answers like they were not enough. Grant listened from behind the glass. That distinction mattered. The review could not invent motive. It could examine behavior. Price then requested Dalton's recent field reports involving perceived threats during identification checks. The initial sample produced 2 prior complaints. In one, a black college administrator had been described as making a sudden movement after being told to retrieve his registration from the glove compartment. The body camera showed the man announcing the movement first. No force had been used, but the complaint alleged the encounter became unnecessarily tense. In another, a black veteran had been described as reaching unpredictably toward a jacket pocket after being asked for identification. The recording showed him asking permission before moving. Grant stared at the summaries. How were these closed? Officer caution. No policy violation. Were they compared with each other? Price shook his head. Different supervisors. Different years. Grant looked toward Dalton's interview room. Then compare them now. At the hospital, Danielle received a call from Grant shortly before noon. Colonel Harper, the review is expanding into prior identification encounters involving Officer Dalton. Danielle was quiet. Because of what happened to me. Because the footage raised questions about his threat perception. Danielle looked toward Rachel. Then compare similar encounters involving white citizens too. Grant paused. We were planning to. Do it before you call anything a pattern. Grant exhaled slowly. Understood. Danielle's voice softened. Captain, one bad decision can ruin a life. A bad investigation can ruin the truth. Do not give either one more power than it deserves. After the call ended, Grant stood over the growing stack of files and understood exactly what Danielle meant. The department did not need a villain before it had evidence. It needed something harder. A complete record. Over the next 3 days, Daniel Price stopped looking at individual moments and started looking at sequences. He reviewed identification encounters involving Eric Dalton, then matched each one against dispatch notes, body camera footage, supervisor comments, and the exact words Dalton used afterward. Some cases showed nothing unusual. Some supported Dalton's decisions. Price documented those too. But a smaller group kept returning to the same problem. A citizen announced a movement. Dalton acknowledged it. Then he reacted as though the movement had happened without warning. Captain Melissa Grant sat beside him as he opened a file involving a white contractor stopped 6 months earlier near a government office. The man had been asked for registration stored inside a center console. He said where it was. Dalton told him to retrieve it. The stop ended without escalation. Price opened another file involving a black veteran named Samuel Pierce. Pierce had been asked for identification kept inside a coat pocket. He announced the location and asked permission to reach. Dalton allowed it, then immediately ordered him to stop moving when his hand approached the pocket. No force had followed, but the report described Pierce as making an unexpected movement. Grant leaned closer. Unexpected according to whom? Price did not answer. He opened the video again. Pierce's voice was clear. My wallet is inside my jacket. Do you want me to get it? Dalton's answer followed. Slowly. Grant looked at Price. That wording sounds familiar. It is. By the afternoon, The review team had identified 4 prior encounters where Dalton's written description of sudden or unpredictable movement did not fully match what the cameras recorded. 3 involved black citizens. 1 involved a Latino driver. Similar stops involving white motorists were not free of tension, but the recorded language tended to be different. Dalton used phrases like misunderstanding, nervous movement, or communication issue. With others, he more often wrote threatening gesture, abrupt reach, or failure to follow direction. Price remained careful. "That does not prove racial motive," he said. Grant nodded. "No, but it tells us what to investigate." At the hospital, Danielle Harper had been cleared to leave under medical follow-up and returned home with Major Rachel Cooper nearby. The first evening outside the hospital was quieter than Danielle expected. Her uniform hung untouched in the bedroom. Her secure phone rested on the kitchen counter. The house felt ordinary, but she did not. Rachel set down a folder. Command Legal reviewed the department's preservation notice. "They are satisfied the evidence is being secured." Danielle nodded. "Good. They also want to know whether you plan to make a public statement." Danielle looked at her. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because the investigation is still moving." Rachel sat across from her. "People already know you are a colonel." Danielle gave a tired smile. "That is exactly why I need to be careful." She looked toward the dark window. "If I speak now, everyone will make this about rank. A colonel was shot. A senior officer was mistreated. That is not the hardest question." Rachel waited. Danielle continued. "The hardest question is what happens when the person reaching for identification has no title anyone cares about." The next morning, Price and Grant interviewed Dalton again. This time, the questions focused on language. Price placed 2 reports side by side. Why is one movement described as nervous and another as threatening when both citizens announced what they were reaching for? Dalton looked at the pages. "Different circumstances. Explain the difference." Dalton paused. "You had to be there." Price nodded toward the monitor. "We were not. The cameras were." Dalton's jaw tightened. "You are reducing split-second decisions to paperwork." Grant answered before Price could. "We are comparing the paperwork to the split second." Dalton looked toward her. "I thought she had a weapon." Grant's voice remained level. "We know what you thought. We are trying to understand what information you had before you thought it." Silence filled the room. Price opened Danielle's footage again, but stopped before the shot. Her voice came through the speakers. "My identification is inside the left pocket. Do you want me to get it?" Then Dalton's answer. "Yes." Slowly. Price froze the image. "Officer Dalton, what changed between those words and your decision?" Dalton stared at the screen. For the first time, he did not reach for training language. He did not mention officer safety. He did not say it happened too fast. He simply said, "I do not know." Grant looked at Price. That answer did not resolve the investigation. It opened it. Later that afternoon, Grant called Danielle with an update. "We found prior cases where recorded movements were described more severely than the footage appears to support." Danielle remained quiet. "How many?" "Not enough for a final conclusion." "Then do not call it one yet." Grant almost smiled. "I knew you would say that." Danielle looked at the identification card resting on her kitchen table. "Captain, I do not need you to prove what people already want to believe. I need you to prove what actually happened." Grant closed the file in front of her. "That is what we are trying to do." Danielle's voice softened. "Then keep going." The call ended. Outside, evening settled over Northern Virginia. The Army had already confirmed who Danielle Harper was. The department was now confronting a harder question: whether Eric Dalton had spent years seeing danger differently, depending on who stood in front of him. By the end of the first week, Daniel Price had enough material to widen the review beyond Eric Dalton's written reports and into the training records that shaped his decisions. Captain Melissa Grant authorized a comparison of field evaluations, firearms judgment exercises, complaint histories, and body camera footage from identification stops over the previous 4 years. The purpose was not to search for a conclusion. It was to understand whether the gap between what Dalton perceived and what the cameras recorded had appeared before. Noah Bennett was asked to attend one of the review sessions because he had worked beside Dalton long enough to recognize habits that paperwork might miss. Price placed several clips on the screen. In one, a white driver reached toward his center console after announcing where his registration was. Dalton waited, watched, and allowed the movement to finish. In another, a black driver announced that his license was inside a jacket pocket. Dalton's posture changed immediately, and his voice became sharper before the man had even moved. No force was used, but the tone was unmistakably different. Price paused the recording. Did you notice this when it happened? Noah stared at the screen. Not like this. What did you notice? Noah thought for several seconds. Eric trusted some people faster. Grant leaned forward. Based on what? Noah shook his head. I do not know. Price replied quietly. That is why we compare behavior instead of guessing at motive. Across town, Danielle Harper had begun returning to limited duty. Her first morning back at Fort Belvoir was deliberately uneventful. No ceremony, no cameras, no speeches. She entered a conference room carrying a plain folder and sat beside Major Rachel Cooper as if the previous week had not altered the way people looked at her. But it had. Officers who normally greeted her with casual professionalism now hesitated, uncertain whether sympathy would feel respectful or intrusive. Danielle noticed and gave them nothing dramatic to react to. She opened the briefing and said, "Let us work." The room relaxed. Later, Rachel followed her into the hallway. "You make it look easy." Danielle stopped. "It is not." Rachel waited. Danielle looked through a window toward the parking lot. "But I refuse to let the worst 10 seconds of my life become the only thing people see when I enter a room." Rachel nodded slowly. Back at the precinct, Price received another set of complaint summaries. One involved a black nurse named Evelyn Carter, stopped late at night after leaving a hospital. She had been asked for identification and told Dalton her wallet was inside a tote bag on the passenger seat. The footage showed her announcing every movement before making it. Dalton's report described her as reaching unpredictably into the vehicle. Another complaint involved a white accountant in nearly the same circumstances. His report described a brief misunderstanding regarding document location. Grant read both lines twice. Same officer? Yes. Same type of request. Close enough to compare. Same outcome. No force in either case. Both citizens were released. Grant leaned back. Then language becomes important. Price nodded. Language tells us how he interpreted the moment after it was over. The department's outside legal advisor joined the review that afternoon and cautioned everyone against treating statistical differences as automatic proof of discriminatory intent. Grant agreed immediately. "We are not interested in automatic anything." Price added, "We are interested in whether the same kind of behavior was consistently described differently depending on who was involved." That evening, Dalton was interviewed again with his representative present. Price showed him the paired reports. Why is one person described as confused and another as threatening when both announced where their documents were? Dalton studied the pages. Every stop feels different in real time. What made these feel different? Body language. Be specific. Dalton looked at the screen but gave no answer. Grant spoke gently. "Officer Dalton, nobody is asking you to confess to a thought you did not have. We are asking you to explain decisions you documented." He rubbed his forehead. "Sometimes you read a situation wrong." Price nodded. "Yes. The question is whether the errors were random." Dalton's eyes lifted. For the first time, he seemed to understand where the review was going. Not toward a single accusation. Toward repetition. Later that night, Grant called Danielle. "We are expanding the comparison further." Danielle listened. "What are you finding?" "Differences in how similar movements were interpreted and described." "Not enough yet for a final finding." Danielle was silent for a moment. "Then keep the language careful." Grant almost laughed. "You keep reminding us not to overstate the case against the man who shot you." Danielle looked down at the scar hidden beneath her sleeve, then toward the uniform hanging across the room. "Because truth does not need exaggeration." Grant's voice softened. "You really believe that?" "I have to." Danielle paused. "Otherwise I would be asking your department to make the same mistake he made. Decide first. Explain later." After the call ended, Grant returned to the review room. Price had arranged the timelines in 2 columns across the wall. Different citizens, different nights, different neighborhoods, the same officer, the same kinds of movements. The differences were no longer invisible. What remained was the hardest part, determining whether those differences were enough to change not only Dalton's future, but the way the department taught every officer to see the person before the perceived threat. 3 weeks later, the review had moved beyond individual clips and into policy, supervision, and patterns of perception. Captain Melissa Grant sat at the head of a conference table while Daniel Price presented the comparison results gathered from years of identification stops, field evaluations, and body camera records. The findings were careful. Most of Eric Dalton's encounters did not show misconduct. Several decisions were supported by policy, but a smaller group revealed a repeated difference that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Black citizens who announced movements toward pockets, bags, or compartments were more often described afterward with words such as threatening, abrupt, or unpredictable. Comparable white citizens were more often described as confused, nervous, or misunderstood. Price did not call that proof of intent. He called it evidence of unequal perception. Grant looked around the room. What changes now? The training commander answered first. We revise how officers are taught to process announced movements. If a citizen states where identification is located and the officer authorizes retrieval, that information has to remain part of the threat assessment. Price added, and report language needs review when recorded behavior does not match descriptions of danger. Grant nodded. Make it department-wide. Noah Bennett attended the first revised training session 2 days later. The instructor showed a simple scenario. A driver said his wallet was inside a jacket pocket. The officer told him to retrieve it. Then the video froze before the driver moved. What do you know at this moment? The instructor asked. Someone answered. The hand is going toward the pocket. Noah shook his head. That is not everything we know. The room turned toward him. We also know why the hand is moving. We told him to move it. The instructor nodded. Exactly. Noah felt the lesson settle deeper than any policy memo could. He had heard Danielle Harper announce the location of her identification. He had heard Dalton give permission. He had still trusted experience over the information directly in front of him. After class, Grant stopped him in the hallway. You are blaming yourself. Noah looked down. I was there. You did not make Dalton's decision. No, but I heard the warning signs before it happened. Grant studied him. Then use that knowledge next time. Across town, Danielle had returned to full duty. Her schedule was crowded again with briefings, command meetings, and personnel reviews, but the incident remained present in quieter ways. She paused longer before reaching into a coat pocket in public. She noticed sudden movements around her more than before. She disliked both reactions, but she accepted that recovery was not the same as forgetting. Major Rachel Cooper joined her after a leadership meeting and handed her a summary of the department's procedural reforms. Danielle read every line. They changed the training? Rachel asked. Yes. Because of you. Danielle shook her head. Because the evidence made the old training incomplete. Rachel smiled faintly. You really refuse to let this become personal. Danielle folded the paper. It was personal when it happened. The solution cannot be. Meanwhile, Dalton remained on administrative leave while the disciplinary review continued. Through his representative, he argued that no training program could remove the need for split-second judgment. Price agreed with that statement. Then he added the question the department could no longer avoid. What happens when judgment consistently discounts information that should reduce perceived danger? Dalton had no immediate answer. The outside review board was given the complete file, including cases that supported Dalton as well as those that raised concern. Danielle insisted on that balance when Grant called her with an update. Do not build the strongest case against him, she said. Build the most accurate one. Grant replied, that is what we are doing. Danielle looked through her office window toward the evening traffic leaving Fort Belvoir. Good. Because if fairness only applies when the evidence helps us, it is not fairness. Later that week, Noah handled a routine stop involving a black teacher whose driver's license was inside a backpack on the passenger seat. The man explained where it was and asked permission to reach. Noah answered, yes. Move slowly. I understand what you are reaching for. The teacher retrieved the wallet. Nothing happened. The stop ended normally. No one watching would have called the moment remarkable. Noah did. For him, those uneventful seconds carried the weight of everything the department had learned. The goal was not to make officers less alert. It was to make sure fear did not erase information. And for the first time since that night outside the convenience store, Danielle's experience was beginning to create something more lasting than outrage. It was creating a different decision before the next mistake had a chance to happen. 4 months after the convenience store incident, the outside review board delivered its preliminary findings to Captain Melissa Grant in a sealed packet. She read the summary twice before calling Daniel Price into her office. The board did not describe Eric Dalton as reckless in every encounter, nor did it claim to know what he believed in the instant before he fired. Instead, it focused on what the records could support. In Danielle Harper's case, Dalton had authorized retrieval of identification, heard her state the exact location, and reacted before confirming whether the movement matched the instruction he had given. In several earlier encounters, his written descriptions of black citizens' movements were more severe than the available recordings appeared to justify. The board called the disparity significant enough to require corrective action, additional supervision, and formal disciplinary review. Grant placed the report on the desk. "No shortcuts," she said. Price nodded. "No exaggeration either." Across Fort Belvoir, Danielle had resumed the rhythm of command almost completely. She attended planning meetings, reviewed personnel decisions, and spent long afternoons discussing readiness with officers who had learned not to treat her recovery as a permanent conversation topic. Major Rachel Cooper noticed something different in her, though. Danielle had become more patient with uncertainty. In meetings, when someone gave an answer too quickly, she asked, "What do we know, and what are we assuming?" The question spread through her staff until junior officers began using it with each other. Rachel mentioned that one evening as they left a conference room. "You know they copied that from you." Danielle adjusted the folder under her arm. "Good habits should travel." Rachel looked at her. "Did it come from what happened?" Danielle stopped near the window. "Partly." She watched soldiers crossing the parking lot below. A decision can feel certain and still be wrong. That is a dangerous thing to forget. At the precinct, the new training policy had already produced measurable changes. Supervisors reviewed identification encounters involving announced movements. Officers were required to document what the citizens said before reaching, what instruction was given, and what changed the threat assessment if the officer later perceived danger. Report language was compared against body camera recordings more closely than before. Some officers complained that the process created extra paperwork. Grant answered the same way each time. "Then write carefully." Noah Bennett had become one of the strongest supporters of the changes, not because he believed policy could erase risk, but because he had seen what happened when information was treated as less important than instinct. During a late afternoon stop, he approached a black man whose registration was in a locked glove compartment. The man explained this before moving and asked permission to open it. Noah answered, "Yes. I understand where you are reaching." His partner watched from the passenger side. The man opened the compartment, retrieved the registration, and handed it over. The records matched. The stop ended without tension. Later, Noah reviewed his own body camera before writing the report. He listened to the man's words again, not because the encounter had gone badly, because he wanted accuracy to become routine. Dalton, meanwhile, remained off patrol pending the final disciplinary decision. His attorney argued that the department was using later analysis to judge a split-second event that had unfolded under stress. The review board acknowledged that concern in writing. Then it noted that split-second judgment still depended on the information available in the seconds before the decision. That distinction became the center of the case. When Grant called Danielle with the preliminary findings, Danielle listened without interruption. "They found the disparity significant," Grant said, "but they stopped short of claiming they could prove motive." Danielle looked across her office at the Army uniform hanging behind the door. "That sounds responsible." Grant hesitated. "You are satisfied with that?" Danielle considered the question. "Satisfied is not the word." "What is?" Danielle looked down at her hands, relieved they did not confuse certainty with truth. Grant remained silent. Danielle continued, "If the evidence supports misconduct, act on it. If it supports policy failure, fix it. If it supports bias in outcomes, but not provable motive, say exactly that. Do not make the story cleaner than reality." Grant exhaled slowly. "You know most people want closure." Danielle looked toward the fading light outside. "Closure is emotional. Accountability has to be accurate." Several days later, Grant received a training evaluation from Noah's unit. Complaints involving identification retrieval had dropped. Supervisors reported fewer escalations caused by misunderstood movements. The numbers were still small, but the direction was clear. That evening, Danielle drove home through Northern Virginia with Rachel's question still in her mind. Had anything truly changed? She thought about Dalton, the investigation, the camera footage, the policies, the officers learning to repeat back what a citizen said before moving. Then she thought about the black man Noah had stopped, a man who would never know her name and never need to. Danielle finally understood the answer. Justice was beginning to move away from her story and into someone else's ordinary afternoon. That was exactly where it belonged. 6 months after the incident, Captain Melissa Grant received the final disciplinary findings before the start of the morning shift. The review did not claim that Eric Dalton had acted with deliberate racial hostility, and it did not ignore the pressures involved in fast police decisions. It focused instead on what could be demonstrated. He had instructed Danielle Harper to retrieve identification from a specific pocket. She had announced the location before moving. No weapon had been reported by dispatch. No weapon had been seen before the shot. His first written account omitted key details that the cameras later confirmed, and several earlier encounters showed similar differences between what black citizens announced and how their movements were described afterward. The department sustained serious failures in judgment, documentation, and threat assessment. Dalton was permanently removed from patrol duties and later separated from the department after the required administrative process concluded. Grant read the decision without satisfaction. There was no clean victory in a case where one mistake had changed so many lives. Noah Bennett learned the result during a training session he now helped teach. On the screen behind him was a simple scenario involving a driver who said his wallet was inside a coat pocket. Noah faced a room of younger officers and asked, "What matters before the hand moves?" One recruit answered, "What the person already told us." Noah nodded. "And what we told them to do." He let the sentence remain there. He no longer spoke about awareness as if it were only about danger. Awareness also meant remembering information that reduced danger. At Fort Belvoir, Danielle had returned fully to command. Her days were once again filled with briefings, readiness reports, personnel decisions, and the ordinary responsibilities that had defined her long before anyone outside the Army knew her name. Major Rachel Cooper brought the final review summary into Danielle's office and placed it on the desk. "It is finished," Rachel said. Danielle read the first page, then the last. "The investigation is finished." Rachel smiled faintly. "You always separate those two things." Danielle looked toward the window. "Because consequences continue after paperwork ends." She asked about the revised training policy. Rachel told her the department had made the changes permanent. Officers were now required to acknowledge announced movements during identification retrieval, document what information they had before escalation, and explain any later change in threat perception. Supervisors audited body camera footage against written descriptions in disputed encounters. Danielle closed the report. Then something useful came from it. A week later, Noah stopped a black father driving home with his teenage son after a registration light malfunctioned. The man explained that his wallet was inside his jacket. Noah replied, "I understand. You can retrieve it slowly." The father did. Noah checked the documents, confirmed the registration, and handed everything back. The entire exchange lasted only a few minutes. The teenager watched quietly from the passenger seat. "Are we good?" the father asked. "You are good," Noah said. The man nodded and drove away. He never learned about Danielle. He never heard Dalton's name. He never knew that a policy written after one terrible night had helped make his own stop ordinary. That was the point. Later that evening, Danielle left her office after sunset and paused beside her car. For a moment, she remembered the convenience store lights, the cold pavement, the command she had followed, and the fraction of a second that had changed everything. She also remembered the cameras, the review rooms, the files, the training sessions, and the officers learning to listen before fear filled in the blanks. Rachel walked up beside her. "Do you think this is justice?" Danielle considered the question. "Part of it. What is the rest?" Danielle looked across the parking lot at soldiers heading home. "The rest is what happens when nobody knows my rank." She opened the car door, then stopped. If the next person can reach for identification after being told to do so, and still be seen as a person before being seen as a threat, then the system learned something. Rachel nodded. Danielle got into the car and drove toward the Virginia night. Her rank had made people pay attention after the mistake. The real measure of justice was whether attention would come sooner for everyone else.